George Palmer thought he knew what secrets looked like. At 53, after burying his wife Sarah 2 years prior, he believed he had seen the darkest corners of human nature during his decades as a criminal defense attorney in Toronto. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he discovered in that dimly lit private room in Ayutthaya, Thailand. The woman he thought he loved, the woman he had traveled halfway around the world to be with, was not who she claimed to be. And her private room? It wasn't reserved for him alone. Before we dive deeper into George's story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust, love, and deception. George Palmer was the kind of man who measured his life in case files and court victories. Tall, graying at the temples, with hands that bore the weight of too many handshakes and too many sleepless nights spent poring over legal documents. Sarah's death from cancer had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell of a man who went through the motions of living without truly being alive. His colleagues noticed the change, how he'd stare out his office window overlooking Lake Ontario for hours, lost in memories of a life that felt increasingly distant. The idea of traveling to Thailand came from his younger brother, Marcus, during one of their increasingly frequent calls. "George, you need to get away from that damn office," Marcus had said, his voice crackling through the phone from his home in Vancouver. "Take the trip Sarah always wanted to take. She'd want you to live, not just exist." Thailand had indeed been Sarah's dream, a place she'd planned to visit during their retirement years that never came. So there George found himself, 6 months after that conversation, stepping off a humid Bangkok street into the ancient grounds of Wat Chaiwathanaram in Ayutthaya. The temple ruins rose around him like ghosts of a forgotten empire, their weathered stones telling stories of kings and kingdoms long since turned to dust. He wasn't particularly religious, but something about the place called to him. Perhaps the same thing that had called to Sarah when she'd circled this destination in countless travel brochures. It was there, in the temple's inner courtyard, that he first saw her. Kanchana moved through the space like she belonged there, like the ancient stones recognized her as kin. She was small, delicate, with long black hair that caught the afternoon light and skin that seemed to glow with an inner warmth. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to flow rather than hang on her frame. And when she looked up and caught George staring, her smile was so genuine, so unguarded, that it actually made him take a step back. "You look lost," she said, her English accented but clear, musical in a way that reminded George of wind chimes on Sarah's back porch. "First time in Ayutthaya?" George found himself nodding, suddenly aware that he had been wandering aimlessly through the ruins for the better part of an hour. "I suppose I'm lost," he admitted, his voice rough from disuse. It had been weeks since he'd had a real conversation with anyone outside of work. Kanchana's laugh was like silver bells. "The temple has a way of making us all feel lost until we find what we're looking for. I'm Kanchana. I work nearby, but I come here often. It helps me think." "George," he managed, extending his hand. When she took it, her skin was impossibly soft, and he found himself holding on just a moment too long. "I'm from Toronto. Just traveling." Running from something or running to something?" she asked, tilting her head in a way that made her hair cascade over one shoulder. It was such a personal question, one that should have made him uncomfortable. But instead, he found himself wanting to answer honestly. Maybe both, George said. And for the first time in months, he felt the knot in his chest loosen just slightly. They spent the next 2 hours walking through the ruins together. Kanchana proved to be an excellent guide, knowing not just the history of the place, but its legends, its ghost stories, the way the light fell differently on certain stones depending on the time of day. She told him about growing up in a village not far from here, about moving to the city for work, about the dreams she harbored of someday traveling to see other ancient places around the world. "What kind of work do you do?" George asked as they sat on a low stone wall, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. For just a moment, something flickered across Kanchana's face, quick as a hummingbird's wing. "I help people relax," she said finally. "Massage therapy. It's good work, honest work, but sometimes the clients." She trailed off, shaking her head. "But enough about that. Tell me about Toronto. Is it as cold as they say?" The deflection was smooth, practiced, but George was too enchanted by the way she said Toronto to notice. They talked until the temple guards began making their final rounds, and when Kanchana suggested they continue their conversation over dinner, George found himself agreeing before his rational mind could intervene. "Pause here for a moment and think about what we've learned so far." Something about Kanchana's response to George's question about her work seemed evasive, don't you think? What strikes you as suspicious about this encounter? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Dinner led to long walks along the Chao Phraya River. Long walks led to late-night conversations in small cafes that smelled of jasmine and lemongrass. George found himself staying in Ayutthaya far longer than he'd planned, extending his hotel reservation week by week. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt alive, felt like himself again. Kanchana had a way of listening that made George feel like the most interesting man in the world. She asked about his cases, his victories and defeats, the weight of defending people who may or may not have been guilty. She told him about her childhood, about learning massage from her grandmother, about the spiritual aspect of healing touch. She spoke of her work with reverence, describing how she could feel tension leave a person's body, how she could sense their pain and help ease it away. "You have healing hands," George told her one evening as they sat by the river, watching long-tail boats navigate the murky water. Without asking, Kanchana had begun massaging his shoulders, her fingers finding knots of stress he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "My grandmother used to say that our hands remember every person we've helped," Kanchana replied, her voice soft against his ear. "That their pain becomes part of us, but so does their relief when we help them let it go." It was beautiful philosophy, and George found himself believing every word. When Kanchana suggested he visit her workplace, a small spa tucked away in one of Ayutthaya's quieter districts, George agreed without hesitation. He trusted her completely by then, and the idea of experiencing her professional skills seemed like a natural extension of their growing intimacy. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a narrow 3-story structure wedged between a noodle shop and a convenience store. The sign out front was in Thai, with small English letters underneath reading Traditional Thai Wellness Center. George followed Kanchana through a beaded curtain into a dimly lit reception area that smelled of sandalwood and something else he couldn't quite identify, something sweet and cloying. "This is my workplace," Kanchana said, her voice somehow different in this space, more professional, more distant. "I have a private room upstairs, very quiet, very peaceful." The woman behind the reception desk looked up as they entered, her eyes moving between George and Kanchana with an expression George couldn't read. She said something in rapid Thai, and Kanchana responded in the same language, her tone sharp, almost defensive. "Everything all right?" George asked. "Oh yes, just discussing scheduling," Kanchana replied, but her smile seemed forced. "Come, let me show you upstairs." George's first red flag should have been the locks. Not just one lock on Kanchana's door, but 3 separate deadbolts, plus a chain. "Security is very important here," she explained when she caught him staring. "We keep valuable oils and equipment in the rooms." The room itself was small, but beautifully appointed. Soft lighting cast gentle shadows across bamboo walls, decorated with traditional Thai artwork. A massage table dominated the center of the space, covered in crisp white linens. In one corner sat a small shrine with incense and flowers, and against the far wall, a cabinet filled with oils and lotions in small glass bottles. But it was what George didn't see that should have bothered him. No certificates on the walls, no professional massage equipment beyond the table, and in the corner, partially hidden behind a folding screen, what looked suspiciously like a regular bed with rumpled sheets. "Very nice," George said, because Kanchana was watching him expectantly, and he wanted to please her. She had become the center of his world so quickly, so completely, that the thought of disappointing her felt physically painful. "I'm glad you like it," Kanchana said, moving to the cabinet and selecting several bottles. "Now, you must promise me something. What happens in this room, it stays between us. Privacy is very important in my work. My clients, they trust me to keep their secrets." George nodded, thinking she was referring to confidentiality. The same kind he maintained with his own clients. But as Kanchana began preparing her oils, mixing scents with practiced ease, George noticed something else. The walls were surprisingly thick for such an old building, and when a motorcycle roared past outside, he could barely hear it. "The room is soundproof," Kanchana explained, noticing his confused expression. "It helps my clients relax completely, without distraction from the outside world." That made sense, George told himself. Perfect sense. But as he undressed and settled onto the massage table, face down as Kanchana instructed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing some invisible threshold, entering territory from which there might be no easy return. Kanchana's hands were indeed magical. She worked with oils that seemed to warm under her touch, finding tension in muscles George hadn't realized were tight. Her technique was unlike any massage he'd ever experienced, combining what felt like legitimate therapeutic work with touches that were unmistakably intimate, sensual. "You carry a lot of pain," she murmured as her hands worked along his spine. "Not just in your body, but in your spirit. I can feel it." George found himself opening up in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death, telling Kanchana about his guilt, his loneliness, his fear that he would never feel whole again. Her hands never stopped moving, never stopped their healing work, and gradually George felt layers of emotional armor peeling away. It was during his third visit that things began to shift in ways George didn't immediately recognize as dangerous. Kanchana had been telling him about a client who had been giving her trouble, a man who had become possessive, demanding more of her time and attention than she was comfortable giving. Some men, they think because they pay for my services, they own me, she said, her voice tight with frustration. They don't understand that what I offer is healing, not other things. George felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Is there anything I can do? I could talk to him, or if you need legal advice. You're so kind, Kanchana said, and when she looked at him, her eyes were bright with tears. Most clients, they see me as a service, not as a person, but you care about me as a human being. That night, George found himself thinking about Kanchana long after he returned to his hotel. He imagined her dealing with difficult clients, men who might try to take advantage of her kindness, her beauty. The protective instinct that had been dormant since Sarah's death roared back to life, and George realized he was falling in love. It was a dangerous realization, one that should have given him pause. Instead, it made him feel more alive than he had in years. The next morning, George woke to find a text message from Kanchana. Her phone had been stolen, she wrote, and she needed money to buy a new one so they could stay in contact. It wasn't much, just enough for a basic smartphone, but she was embarrassed to ask. George transferred the money without hesitation. It was nothing to him, pocket change really, and the gratitude in Kanchana's voice when she called him from her new phone made it feel like the best investment he'd ever made. But the request didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, there was always something. Her grandmother was sick and needed medicine. The rent on her room had gone up unexpectedly. Her scooter needed repairs. Each request came with apologies, with promises to pay him back, with stories that tugged at George's heartstrings and opened his wallet. George told himself he didn't mind. What was money compared to the happiness Kanchana had brought back into his life? Besides, he could afford it. His law practice was successful, his expenses minimal since Sarah's death. And if helping Kanchana made him feel needed, wanted, what was the harm? The harm, George would later realize, was in how completely he had begun to depend on Kanchana's approval, her attention, her presence in his life. She had become his entire reason for staying in Thailand, his excuse for avoiding the empty house waiting for him back in Toronto. When she was happy, George felt purposeful. When she was stressed or upset, George felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. It was a dependency that didn't go unnoticed by others. The hotel staff had begun giving George pitying looks when he mentioned extending his stay yet again. His brother Marcus called with increasing frequency, his voice tight with concern. George, you've been there for 4 months, Marcus said during one particularly tense conversation. Your partners are asking questions. Your clients are getting restless. When are you coming home? I don't know, George admitted, staring out his hotel window toward the part of town where Kanchana worked. Maybe never. Jesus, George, listen to yourself. This isn't healthy. You're obsessing over some woman you barely know. I know her better than I knew Sarah when I married her. George shot back, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. The truth was, despite all their hours together, Kanchana remained mysteriously elusive about many aspects of her life. Where exactly she lived, who her friends were, what she did when she wasn't with him. But George pushed those doubts away. Love required trust, and trust required faith in the absence of complete knowledge. Sarah had taught him that, back when he was young enough to believe in fairy tales. The beginning of the end came on a humid Thursday evening in late May. George had arrived at the wellness center for his usual appointment, but Kanchana was nowhere to be found. The woman at the reception desk, who George had never seen before, spoke no English and seemed confused by his presence. George waited for over an hour before trying Kanchana's phone, only to discover the number was no longer in service. Panic began to set in. Had something happened to her? Was she in trouble? The protective instincts that had been growing stronger each day kicked into overdrive, and George found himself pushing past the reception desk toward the stairs leading to the upper floors. Sir, you cannot go up there," the receptionist called after him in broken English, but George was already taking the steps 2 at a time. He found Kanchana's door easily enough, but when he knocked, a different voice answered. Male, speaking Thai in rapid, angry bursts. George knocked again, harder this time, and called Kanchana's name. The door opened to reveal a thin Thai man in his 30s, shirtless and clearly agitated. Behind him, George could see into the room he thought he knew so well. But it looked different now. The massage table was gone, replaced by the bed he'd glimpsed behind the screen. And on that bed, hastily pulling on clothes, was Kanchana. But the woman George saw in that moment seemed like a stranger. Her hair was different, shorter, and styled in a way that changed the shape of her face. Her makeup was heavier, more dramatic, and her body, the body George thought he knew from their intimate sessions, looked somehow different in the harsh light streaming through the window. "George," Kanchana said, her voice pitched higher than usual, almost panicked. "You're not supposed to be here." "Not now?" "I was worried," George said, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Your phone was disconnected and you missed our appointment." The Thai man said something sharp to Kanchana, who responded in the same language. Their exchange was heated, intense, and George didn't need to understand the words to recognize the dynamic at play. This wasn't a casual encounter. This was business. "You need to leave," Kanchana said, turning back to George, but her voice was different now, harder, more businesslike. "I will call you later." "Who is he?" George demanded, though part of him already knew the answer. "What's going on here?" "He is a client," Kanchana said, unable to meet George's eyes. "Just a client, like you." The words hit George like a physical blow. "Like you." All those hours of intimacy, of emotional connection, of thinking he was special, that what they shared was unique. All of it reduced to 4 simple words. Just a client, like you. Before you continue, hit subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments. Have you or anyone you know ever been deceived by someone you trusted completely? Your stories might help others avoid similar situations. George stumbled backward, his mind reeling with implications he didn't want to accept. The private room that wasn't private, the soundproof walls, the multiple locks, the constant requests for money. All the signs had been there, bright as neon, but he'd been too blinded by loneliness and desire to see them. "I need to go," he said, but his feet wouldn't move. He stood there, swaying slightly, as the world he'd constructed over the past months crumbled around him. "George, please," Kanchana began, but the Thai man cut her off with a sharp command. She looked between them, torn, and George saw something in her face that might have been genuine regret. Or maybe that was just another performance, another layer of the elaborate fiction she'd constructed for his benefit. George finally managed to turn away, to walk back down the stairs and through the beaded curtain into the humid evening air. But even as he walked, his phone was buzzing with calls and text messages from Kanchana. Apologies, explanations, promises that it wasn't what it looked like, that he was special, that she cared about him in ways she didn't care about her other clients. Client. There was that word again, following him like a curse. That night, alone in his hotel room, George did what he should have done months earlier. He researched. He Googled the wellness center and found reviews that painted a very different picture than the one Kanchana had presented. References to full-service massage and beautiful girls who will do anything for the right price. Forums where Western men shared tips about which establishments offered the most for your money. George felt sick as he read, each review driving home how thoroughly he'd been played. But even worse than the embarrassment was the growing realization that there were deeper deceptions he hadn't even begun to uncover. It took him 3 days of detective work, using skills he'd honed during decades of legal investigation, to piece together the truth. The wellness center was owned by a Thai businessman with connections to several similar establishments across the country. The women who worked there weren't licensed massage therapists. They were sex workers, some voluntary, others trapped in situations they couldn't easily escape. And Kanchana? The name itself was likely fake, as were many of the stories she told him. But the most shocking discovery came when George found a social media profile that matched her photos, but told a very different story about her life. Her real name was Kanin, and she had been born male. George stared at the profile photos, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the woman he thought he'd known. The timeline was confusing at first, showing a gradual transition over several years. Early photos showed a young man with delicate features and a shy smile. Later photos documented surgical procedures, hormone therapy, the slow transformation into the woman George had fallen in love with. But it was the captions that truly broke his heart. Posts about the difficulty of finding acceptance, about family rejection, about the limited options available to transgender women in Thailand, about survival requiring choices no one should have to make. George closed his laptop and sat in the dark of his hotel room, trying to process layers of deception that went beyond anything he'd imagined. The woman he'd loved wasn't the person he thought she was, but she also wasn't entirely the predator he'd initially assumed after discovering her true profession. She was something more complex, more human, and infinitely more tragic. The confrontation came 2 days later, when George finally responded to one of Kanchana's increasingly desperate messages. They met at the same temple where they'd first encountered each other, but the ancient stones that had once seemed magical now felt cold and judgmental. Kanchana arrived 20 minutes late, looking younger without her makeup, more vulnerable in simple jeans and a t-shirt. When she saw George waiting by the same wall where they'd sat on their first day together, her steps faltered. You know, she said, and it wasn't a question. I know some of it, George replied. Maybe not all of it. But enough. They stood there for a long moment, neither sure how to begin a conversation that would unravel months of carefully constructed fiction. My name is really Cannon, she said finally, settling onto the stone wall with careful distance between them. I was born male, but that was never who I was inside. The transition, it's expensive. Surgery, hormones, the recovery time when you can't work. There aren't many options for people like me. So you decided to deceive lonely Western men, George said, trying to keep the bitterness out of his voice. I decided to survive. Kanin shot back, some of her old fire returning. Do you know what it's like? To be born in the wrong body, in a country where your family disowns you for being who you are? To have limited education and no legal protections, and a society that sees you as entertainment at best, a crime against nature at worst? George had to admit, he didn't know. Couldn't know. The massage business, it's one of the few ways trans women can make enough money to live, Kanin continued. Some of the girls, they're saving for more surgery, or sending money home to families who pretend they don't exist. Others are just trying to make it through another day. And the clients? Men like me? Kanin's expression softened slightly. Most of them know what they're paying for. They come looking for a fantasy, for an experience they can't get at home. But you... She paused, seeming to struggle with words. You were different. You talked to me like I was a person, not a service. You listened to my stories, even the fake ones, like they mattered. They did matter to me, George said quietly. You mattered to me. Even if it was all pretense. It wasn't all pretense, Kanin said. And for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice held the warmth George remembered. The time we spent together, the conversations, the way you made me feel. That was real. Maybe the only real thing in my life for a long time. George wanted to believe her, but trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. The money I gave you, the stories about your grandmother, your rent, your phone. Some of it was true, Kanin said defensively. My grandmother was sick, though not in the way I told you. She disowned me when I began transitioning. And the money. Yes, I needed it, but not just for me. There are younger girls at the center, girls who are newer to this life, who haven't learned how to protect themselves yet. I help them when I can. It was a complicated truth, one that didn't excuse the deception, but added layers of moral ambiguity George wasn't prepared to navigate. He found himself thinking of his legal practice, of clients whose actions were wrong, but whose motivations were understandable, even sympathetic. What happens now? He asked. Now you go back to your real life, Kanin said simply. Back to Toronto, to your law practice, to the world where you belong, and I go back to mine. What if I don't want to go back? Then you're a fool, Kanin said, but not without kindness. What we had, George, it was beautiful while it lasted, but it was never going to last. You know that, don't you? Deep down, you knew it couldn't be real. George wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right, of course. Some part of him had always known that what they shared existed in a bubble, separate from real life and its complications. He'd chosen to believe in the fantasy because the alternative was returning to a world that felt empty and meaningless. As they sat there in the fading light, George found himself thinking about Sarah, about the honest, complicated, sometimes difficult, but ultimately real love they'd shared. What he'd felt for Kanchana had been intoxicating, all-consuming, but it had been built on foundations of sand. Real love required truth, even when that truth was painful. "I need to know one more thing," George said as they prepared to part ways. "Did any of it mean anything to you? The real you, not the person you were pretending to be?" Kanin looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, George believed her completely, for the first time since he'd learned her real name. "It meant everything to me," she said. "For a few months, I got to be someone who was loved just for existing, not for what I could provide. That's a gift I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." They didn't say goodbye. George simply stood up, walked away from the temple ruins, and didn't look back. But as he reached the street, he heard Kanin call his name. When he turned, she was standing silhouetted against the ancient stones, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "Be happy, George," she called out. "You deserve happiness, real happiness." The flight back to Toronto was the longest 12 hours of George's life. He spent most of it staring out the window at endless sky, trying to process everything that had happened, everything he'd learned about himself and about the complex ways people survive in an indifferent world. Back in his empty house in Rosedale, George found himself caught between two worlds. His colleagues welcomed him back with carefully neutral expressions and questions about his extended vacation. His clients needed attention. His life required reconstruction. But everything felt surreal, like he was moving through someone else's existence. The depression that followed was different from what he'd experienced after Sarah's death. This wasn't the sharp grief of loss, but the dull ache of disillusionment. The recognition that he'd been willing to abandon everything real in his life for a beautiful lie. George threw himself into therapy with the same intensity he'd once brought to his legal cases. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychiatrist who specialized in helping people recover from manipulative relationships, helped him understand the psychology of what he'd experienced. "You weren't just deceived by Kanchana, Doctor," Harper explained during one of their sessions. "You were deceived by your own desperate need to feel vital again, to matter to someone. Grief makes us vulnerable in ways we don't always recognize." "But I'm educated," George protested. "I've spent decades recognizing manipulation in legal contexts. How could I be so blind?" "Because this wasn't just manipulation, Doctor," Harper replied. "From what you've described, Kanchana genuinely cared about you, even as she was deceiving you. That combination of real affection and calculated deception is one of the most difficult things for the human mind to process. We want to believe that love is either pure or false, but real relationships exist in the gray areas between those extremes." It took George almost a year to feel like himself again, to trust his own judgment, to believe that he could form genuine connections with people without being deceived or manipulated. The process was painful, often humiliating, but ultimately necessary. During that time, he found himself thinking often about Kanin, wondering if she was safe, if she'd found a way out of the life that had trapped them both in their elaborate deception. He considered trying to contact her, to help in some way. But Dr. Harper counseled against it. "Your desire to help her is admirable," she said, "but it's also potentially dangerous. You're still processing your feelings about what happened, and attempting to maintain contact could re-traumatize both of you. The kindest thing you can do for Kanchana now is to let her move forward with her own healing." The turning point came 18 months after George's return to Toronto. He was working late in his office, reviewing case files for a complex fraud trial, when his secretary buzzed him with an unexpected call. "Mr. Palmer, there's someone on the line who says it's about your time in Thailand. Should I take a message?" George's heart hammered against his ribs. "Put them through." The voice that came through his phone speaker was unfamiliar, heavily accented, but speaking clear English. "Mr. Palmer, my name is Detective Somchai Ratanakon with the Royal Thai Police. I'm calling about a woman you may have known during your time in Ayutthaya. She went by the name Kanchana." George's mouth went dry. Is she all right?" "That's why I'm calling, sir. We're investigating a human trafficking operation that was centered around several massage parlors in the region. Your name came up in our investigation as someone who had extended contact with one of the victims." "Victims?" "Mr. Palmer, the woman you knew as Kanchana was not operating independently, as she may have led you to believe. She and several other transgender women were being controlled by an organized criminal network. They were forced to turn over most of their earnings and were threatened with violence if they tried to leave or seek help." The room seemed to spin around George. Everything he thought he understood about his relationship with Kaneen shifted once again. She hadn't been a skilled manipulator preying on lonely Western men. She had been a victim herself, trapped in a system that exploited her desperation and vulnerability. "The good news," Detective Ratanakon continued, "is that we've arrested the main perpetrators and shut down their operation. Several of the women, including Kanchana, have been placed in protective custody and are receiving support services. However, she specifically asked me to contact you." "She did." "She wanted you to know that the money you provided, the money she told you was for personal expenses, was actually being used to help other victims escape the trafficking network. She was working as an informant for our investigation, gathering evidence while pretending to comply with her captor's demands." George sat down heavily in his leather chair, his mind struggling to process this new layer of revelation. Kaneen hadn't just been a victim or a manipulator. She had been fighting back, using whatever resources she could access, including his money, to help others in similar situations. "She also wanted me to give you a message," the detective continued. "She said to tell you that the love you showed her gave her the strength to believe she deserved better, and that believing she deserved better gave her the courage to help bring down the people who were hurting her and others." After Detective Ratanakon hung up, George sat alone in his office as darkness fell over Toronto. The city lights twinkled beyond his windows, but he barely saw them. Instead, he was thinking about courage, about the different forms it could take, about how wrong he'd been to see Kaneen as either predator or simple victim, when the truth was far more complex. 3 weeks later, George received a package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter in careful English and a small Buddha statue carved from dark wood. "Dear George," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and that you have found peace since returning to your real life. Detective Ratanakon told me he spoke with you, So you know now that much of what I told you was true, just not in the ways I let you believe. I want you to know that meeting you changed something fundamental in me. For the first time in years, someone saw me as worthy of care, of attention, of love. That feeling, even built on the complicated circumstances we found ourselves in, reminded me that I deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. When the police approached me about becoming an informant, I said yes partly because I was tired of being afraid, but mostly because I remembered how it felt to be valued by someone like you. I thought about the other girls in situations like mine, and I wanted them to have the chance to experience what you gave me, even briefly. I don't expect forgiveness for deceiving you. What I did was wrong, even if my circumstances were complicated. But I hope you can understand that you saved me in ways you never intended. The money you gave me helped rescue 6 other women from trafficking. The love you showed me helped me remember that I was human, not just a commodity. I'm safe now, in a new place, starting a new life. I am learning to be Kanin without pretending to be Kanchana, if that makes sense. It is scary, but also wonderful. I hope you find love again, George. Real love, honest love, with someone who can give you all the truth you deserve. You're a good man with a good heart, and you deserve happiness. The Buddha statue is from the temple where we met. I bought it the day after our last conversation there. I have carried it with me through everything that followed, and it helped me remember that some things are sacred, even when everything else feels broken. Please keep it, and when you look at it, remember not the deception, but the moments when what we shared was real. Those moments mattered. They changed both of us. With gratitude and love, Kanin George set the letter down and picked up the Buddha statue. It was small enough to fit in his palm, carved with exquisite detail. The face was serene, peaceful, with a slight smile that reminded him of the expression Kanin wore during their quiet moments together by the river. 6 months later, George was surprised to find himself on a date. Dr. Harper had been encouraging him to consider putting himself back into the world, to risk connection again, despite everything he'd been through. Margaret Chen was a fellow attorney, someone he'd known professionally for years, but never considered in a romantic context until a mutual friend suggested they might enjoy each other's company. She was nothing like Kanin. Margaret was direct where Kanin had been mysterious, practical where Kanin had been dreamlike, grounded in a reality that Kanin had never been able to fully inhabit. But as they sat across from each other in a small Italian restaurant, George found himself appreciating these differences rather than mourning them. "You seem distracted," Margaret observed as they waited for dessert. "Second thoughts about this?" "No," George said, surprised to realize he meant it. "Actually, I was thinking about how nice it is to be with someone who is exactly who she appears to be." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like there's a story behind it." George considered how much to share. His experience in Thailand felt like something from another lifetime, but it had shaped him in fundamental ways. "There is a story," he said finally. "Several stories, actually. Some of them painful, all of them educational. Maybe I'll tell you sometime, if you'd like to hear them." "I'd like that very much," Margaret said, and George believed her. As they walked to their cars after dinner, George felt something he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's death. hope for the future. Not the desperate, grasping hope he'd felt with Kanin, but something steadier, more sustainable. The hope of a man who had been tested by loss and deception and had somehow found his way back to a place where authentic connection was possible. That night, George sat in his study, looking at the Buddha statue on his desk. In the 18 months since receiving Kanin's letter, he had learned more about the human trafficking investigation that had freed her and the others. The criminal network had been extensive, involving dozens of victims and generating millions of dollars in profits. Kanin's role as an informant had been crucial in gathering the evidence needed to dismantle the operation completely. George had quietly donated a substantial sum to organizations working to combat human trafficking in Southeast Asia, specifying that the money should go toward helping transgender individuals who were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. He never told anyone about the donation, not even Dr. Harper. It felt like something private between him and Kanin, a way of honoring what they'd shared while acknowledging the harm that had been done. Now, as he prepared for bed, George reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had gone to Thailand running from grief and had found himself entangled in a web of deception, exploitation, and ultimately unexpected heroism. He had been a victim and a rescuer, often simultaneously, in ways he was only beginning to understand. The experience had taught him things about himself he wasn't sure he wanted to know. That he was capable of self-deception when it served his emotional needs. That loneliness could make him vulnerable to manipulation. That his privilege as a wealthy Western man carried responsibilities he hadn't always acknowledged. But it had also taught him about resilience, both his own and that of people facing circumstances far more difficult than anything he'd ever experienced. It had shown him that love could exist in imperfect forms and still have real power. It had demonstrated that redemption was possible even in the most complicated situations. Most importantly, it had taught him that healing from profound loss didn't require replacing what was lost with something identical. Sarah would always be irreplaceable, the gold standard of honest, committed love in his life. What he'd shared with Kanin had been beautiful and meaningful, despite its complications, but it had never been meant to last. What he might build with Margaret, or with someone else, if things didn't work out with her, would be different from both previous relationships, but no less valuable for being different. As George turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he paused to touch the Buddha statue one more time. Somewhere in Thailand, Kanin was building a new life, one where she could be herself without having to perform survival for men like him. Somewhere in Toronto, Margaret was probably thinking about their evening together, deciding whether she wanted to see him again. Somewhere in his heart, Sarah's memory remained intact, no longer a source of paralyzing grief, but a foundation of gratitude for having experienced unconditional love. George Palmer had learned that life was not about replacing what was lost, but about remaining open to what was possible. It was about finding the courage to trust again after being deceived, to love again after being wounded, to hope again after being disappointed. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, George felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace with the complexity of being human. The final chapter of George's story came 2 years later. in the form of a wedding invitation that arrived at his Toronto office with familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he found a card written in both Thai and English, announcing the marriage of Kanin Ratanakon to Dr. Siripon Watana, a social worker who specialized in helping trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. The photo included with the invitation showed two radiant women in traditional Thai wedding attire, standing in what appeared to be the same temple courtyard where George and Kanin had first met. Kanin looked genuinely happy in a way George had never seen during their time together. Her smile unguarded and her eyes bright with joy. A handwritten note was tucked behind the formal invitation. Dear George, I wanted you to be among the first to know that I have found my person, my true love, my partner in all the ways that matter. Siripon helped me heal from everything I went through. And in learning to heal, I learned to love authentically for the first time in my life. Our work together, helping other survivors, has become the foundation of our relationship and our shared mission in life. I thought you would want to know that the story you were part of had a happy ending, even if it wasn't the ending either of us expected when we first met. Thank you for being part of my journey toward this happiness. With love and gratitude, Kanin. George smiled as he read the note, surprised by how genuinely happy he felt for her. There was no jealousy, no sense of loss, just pure joy that someone who had endured so much had found peace and authentic love. He was still holding the invitation when Margaret knocked on his office door. They had been together for over a year now, taking things slowly, building trust and intimacy at a pace that honored both of their past experiences and their hopes for the future. Good news or bad news? Margaret asked, noticing his expression. The best kind of news, George replied, handing her the invitation. Someone I used to know has found happiness. As Margaret read the invitation, George realized that his own story was still being written. The chapter that had begun with grief and detoured through deception and recovery was leading towards something new, something built on the foundation of everything he'd learned about love, loss, and the courage required to remain open to connection despite the risks. That evening, George and Margaret attended a fundraising dinner for a local organization that provided legal services to victims of human trafficking. It was George's way of honoring both his experience with Kanin and his commitment to using his privilege to help others. As they listened to survivors share their stories, George was struck by the common threads: resilience in the face of exploitation, the power of genuine care to spark healing, and the possibility of transformation even in the darkest circumstances. After the event, as they walked through downtown Toronto under a canopy of stars, Margaret took George's hand and said, "I'm proud of you, you know, for the work you do, for the way you've learned from your experiences, for the man you've become." George squeezed her hand in return. "I'm proud of us," he replied, "for taking the time to build something real." If you've stayed with George's story until the end, you understand that truth is often more complex than we want it to be, and that healing rarely follows the path we expect. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the messy, complicated, ultimately beautiful reality of human experience. And please, share in the comments. What's the most important lesson you've learned about trust, love, or recovery from difficult experiences? Your insights might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone in our struggles, and that even our most painful experiences can become sources of wisdom and strength. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're sharing another story that will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, redemption, and the surprising ways